A young, pretty servant girl at home alone with her invalid employer in a quiet residential neighborhood. A mysterious letter hand delivered in the morning and an unexpected knock at the door in the evening. These events would culminate in a murder mystery that was as horrifying as it was baffling. Welcome back to Victorian True Crime. Today, we're talking about the murder of Sarah Jane Roberts. The year was 1880. The place, Westbourne Grove, Harbury, a small, sleepy town just north of Manchester. Living in one of the tidy, semi-detached houses in this quiet residential area were the Greenwoods, an elderly couple named Richard and Mary Ann, and their young live-in servant, Sarah Jane Roberts. The daughter of a respectable farmer from Pembroke, Wales, Sarah Jane was a bright, sensible girl of 18. In 1878, she had followed her brother to Manchester to find work, and had entered the Greenwoods' employ in about March of 1879. In contrast to so many nightmarish employer-servant stories we hear from this period, the situation would actually prove an ideal one. By all accounts, Sarah Jane got on extremely well with the kind elderly couple. In fact, in the 10 months of her employment, she had become almost like a daughter to the Greenwoods. Competent, modest, and hardworking, Sarah Jane seemed to be a comfort to the couple in their advancing age. So determined were they to keep her that Mr. Greenwood had even made provisions for Sarah Jane in his will. On January 7th, 1880, everything seemed normal in the Greenwood household. Earlier in the day, Mr. Greenwood's business partner, a man named Mr. Cooper, had come calling. When Sarah Jane opened the door to admit him, Mr. Cooper noticed a letter lying on the porch. Lacking any sort of postage, the letter had clearly been delivered by hand. Mr. Cooper teasingly said, "Well, Jane, here's a love letter for you," and handed it over. The letter was not, in fact, for the young maid, but for her master. She gave it to Mr. Greenwood, who proceeded to read the message aloud with some confusion. The letter read, quote, "Mr. Greenwood, I want to take the land near the coal yard, behind the druggist shop, Queen's Road. I will pay either monthly, quarterly, or yearly, and will pay in advance. I will meet you tonight from 5 to 6 o'clock at the Three Tons Tavern, and will tell you all the particulars. I don't know your address, or I would have posted it." The letter was signed W. Wilson, Oldham Road. Mr. Greenwood found it strange that instead of calling at the house, the mysterious W. Wilson had just pushed the letter underneath the door. Even stranger, the letter claimed not to know Greenwood's address, despite being hand-delivered to that same address. It was odd, sure, but not necessarily alarming. Greenwood was not particularly keen to part with the land by the coal yard, but his wife persuaded him that no harm would come from keeping the appointment at the Three Tons. And so, at 5 p.m., Mr. Greenwood left his house and walked the not inconsiderable distance to the Three Tons to meet W. Wilson. He was perplexed, and likely annoyed after his 30-minute walk, to find that no such person was present at the tavern. He waited for a time, but no one matching the letter writer's description ever arrived. At 6:20, Greenwood at last gave up and went back home, telling the barman that if this mysterious Wilson belatedly appeared, he would have to call on him at home. Meanwhile, back at the house at Westbourne Grove, Mary Ann Greenwood had been resting upstairs with her bedroom door open. Suffering from long-standing health issues, Mrs. Greenwood had been confined to her bed for weeks and was rarely well enough to leave her room. At 6:25 p.m., almost the exact time Mr. Greenwood was leaving the tavern, Mary Ann heard a knock at the front door below. For the next several minutes, she listened to the faint sounds of the interaction drifting up from the ground floor. When questioned later, Mrs. Greenwood would describe in detail how she had heard Sarah Jane answer the door, with no indication of distress or alarm, and let the person inside. She then heard the sound of muted voices, though she couldn't make out anything of what was said, followed by footsteps passing through the hall into the kitchen. Once in the kitchen, the voices and the footsteps ceased. For a few minutes, there was only silence. Then a blood-curdling scream rang through the house, followed quickly by another. And then, nothing. Alarmed, Mrs. Greenwood called out to Sarah Jane, but received no answer. She attempted to rise from bed, but could only drag herself as far as the staircase. Instead, she screamed to raise the alarm. The next-door neighbors rushed in and, to their horror, found Sarah Jane collapsed on the floor of the kitchen, her skull fractured from 2 vicious blows with a blunt object. She was still breathing, but only just. Medical assistance was sent for, but poor Sarah Jane died within 5 minutes without ever uttering a word. When the police arrived, they were met with a perplexing scene. The killer, whoever it was, had vanished without a trace, without even an indication of which exit they had used to make their escape. A large sum of cash left out in the next room and various other valuables were untouched. There was no murder weapon found at the scene, no robbery, and no signs of a struggle. Just a girl lying in a pool of blood. Investigators quickly realized that the W. Wilson letter had been a trap. A cunning ploy meant to lure Mr. Greenwood away from the house, leaving his young servant alone with only his invalid wife. But who had written it, and what had they wanted? Many believed it was a burglary gone wrong. Others whispered more scandalous theories. It was proposed that Greenwood himself was involved. that there had perhaps been an improper intimacy between master and maid. But everyone who knew the household vehemently refuted any such claim that the 70-year-old Greenwood could be having an affair with the 18-year-old Sarah Jane, whom everyone insisted he regarded like a beloved granddaughter. On top of which, Mr. Greenwood had an airtight alibi. The business partner, Mr. Cooper, was also suspected. He had conveniently been the one to bring attention to the letter after all, but he too was soon cleared with a rock-solid alibi and a lack of motive. Over the next several weeks of the investigation, the milkman and various other neighborhood characters were looked into, and each cleared one by one. Curiously, Mrs. Greenwood vividly recalled the footsteps she had heard as being very light, which had led her to believe that the visitor had been a woman. But investigators and medical examiners all insisted that the blows Sarah Jane had sustained could only have been inflicted by a strong adult man. Though a botched burglary had initially been the favored theory, police were eventually forced to conclude that the murder had been premeditated and that Sarah Jane had clearly been the target. Many believe this must be the work of an angry current or former lover, but no such person was ever identified, even after hours of sifting through Sarah Jane's prodigious collection of personal letters. Her brother was even at one point considered a suspect, but here again, there was no evidence or motive. One of the odder moments of the case came after the funeral, when authorities tried to photograph Sarah Jane's eyeballs, hoping to capture a last reflection of the killer's face. Yes, they actually thought the image might still be there, imprinted on her retinas. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. But the idea that the after image of the last thing a dead person saw could be retained on their retinas continued to be a misguided belief for years to come. Sarah Jane Roberts was buried on January 10th, 3 days after her murder. The distraught Greenwoods footed the entire bill for the funeral. The case soon went cold. As we often see with many sensationalist unsolved murders in Victorian England, there were later confessions from drunkards, soldiers, even a man in America claiming he'd killed an Emma Roberts. None of them checked out. Sarah Jane's murder remains unsolved to this day. Her gravestone still stands in Christ Church Cemetery, Harpury, carved with the inscription, "In memory of Sarah Jane Roberts, born March 1st, 1862, met with her death by an unknown hand, January 7th, 1880. So what do you guys think? Was this a crime of passion, a burglary gone wrong, or something more twisty and sinister? Drop your theories in the comments, because this one still keeps me up at night.